In this tutorial, you will learn how to implement developer workflow for Kubernetes using popular tools such as Skaffold and Visual Studio Code. For complete details, check out AgileStacks documentation site at docs.agilestacks.com and look for a tutorial named Developer Workflow, Accelerated Development and Deployment on Kubernetes with Skaffold. It will give you detailed instructions as well as required tools that you need to install first. One of the requirements is to have an existing Kubernetes cluster where we can deploy this Python Flask application. And for the purpose of this tutorial, we will use demo clusters that are available as part of AgileStacks demo environment. You can use one of these, or you can bring your own cluster. Here is the view of AgileStacks control plane, and here I have a few clusters already deployed. I can use tools that are part of this cluster, such as Kubernetes dashboard, which shows me all the pods and services and deployments that are running on this Kubernetes cluster. Now let's switch to the command line in the terminal, and I will introduce you to Hub CLI, which is a powerful and easy to use tool to manage your infrastructure as code. Before we start using Hub CLI, we need to log in, and that will return me a login token that I need to export into my shell environment variable. Then I can execute other commands. For example, hubls will return a list of all clusters that are running in my environment. I'm going to pick the first cluster and use a hub configure command in order to set the context for my footer commands. Hub configure generates env file, and what I'm going to do, I'm going to just execute it in bash. Here's the content of this file. It pretty much is responsible for setting up environment variables. Let's make sure that Kubernetes cluster is up and running. Great, so I can look at all the services that are running. I can also try kubectl get nodes to see what nodes are currently running in the cluster. And next I will use Hub CLI in order to generate deployment files for my Python Flask application. I'm going to run make.hub generate, and it will create files that are required to deploy this application to Kubernetes. For example, Kubernetes deployment file, Kubernetes service file, and Skaffold configuration. So we are ready now to open the IDE, and I will use Microsoft Visual Studio Code, which is a great IDE to develop Python Flask applications. We have also installed several additional plugins. One of these plugins is Google Cloud Code that helps me to work with Kubernetes clusters without having to leave the IDE environment. So I will use this plugin in order to select my active namespace. I'm going to deploy application into the default namespace. And let's now start Skaffold. Press Shift, Command P, then select Run Task. Pick Skaffold from the list and then select Dev. This will launch Skaffold from inside of IDE. And Skaffold is the tool that is responsible for wrapping Python Flask application into a Docker container, pushing this Docker container image to a Docker registry, and finally deploying it to the Kubernetes cluster. While Skaffold is running, you can take a look at the application source code. It is located in the source folder. There are Python, HTML, JavaScript files that are responsible for creating this application. There are also Kubernetes configuration files that we generated automatically. There was no need to write them manually. Great. Skaffold has deployed this application to the Kubernetes cluster. And in order to test it, I will press Shift, Command P, run task, and then select Ingress, open in browser. Yay, here's my application, Python Flask application, deployed to the Kubernetes cluster. I can interact with it by moving my mouse pointer over one of these tiles. And next I will demonstrate how to change the application source code. So I will select this array and let's replace this with, let's say, AWS, GCP, Azure, click Save. And if we switch to the Skaffold window, you'll see that Skaffold just updated the application with the latest code changes. There we go. Now I'll switch back to Chrome browser and see some of these words are now different the way I changed them. Alright, so similarly to live code changes, we can also set debug breakpoints and view application output straight from the IDE. Essentially work with the remote Kubernetes cluster in the same way as we are used to work with our local development environment. This completes this tutorial. For additional details, please check out our documentation site at docs.agilestacks.com. There are several additional tutorials that are published there. Thank you for watching.